The laughter in the ballroom stopped the moment Lady Prudence Whitmore raised her voice loud enough for every guest to hear. "No gentleman would ever choose you," she said, looking straight at her niece. "You have no fortune, no beauty worth mentioning, and no talent for charming anyone. You should be grateful I even brought you tonight." Eleanor Whitmore stood frozen near the edge of the dance floor, her gloved hands pressed tightly together. The candles above her seemed to burn brighter, or perhaps it was simply the heat rising to her face. Every eye in the room had turned toward her. She could hear a few muffled laughs, quickly hidden behind fans and gloved hands, and the quiet murmurs of guests who had nothing better to do than feed on another woman's shame. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear into the garden beyond the tall windows and never return. But she had learned long ago that running only gave her aunt more to say later, in private, when there was no one else to witness the cruelty. So Eleanor lifted her chin, the way her mother had taught her before she died, and said nothing at all. It was in that silence that a man stepped forward from near the far wall, where he had been standing with a glass of wine untouched in his hand. He was tall, with dark hair combed back neatly, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. Eleanor had never seen him before, but she recognized the hush that spread through the room as people realized who he was. Alexander Vane, Duke of Ashcombe. He walked toward her with unhurried steps, as though the entire room were not staring at him, as though Lady Prudence's cruel words still did not hang in the air like smoke after a fire. He stopped in front of Eleanor and bowed. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice calm and clear enough for everyone to hear, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" For a moment, Eleanor could not speak. She searched his face for mockery, for some hidden joke at her expense, the kind she had grown used to expecting from strangers who took their cue from her aunt. But there was none. His expression was steady, almost solemn, as if he were making a promise rather than a request. She placed her hand in his. The orchestra, which had faltered into silence during Lady Prudence's outburst, began to play again, a little unevenly at first, then finding its rhythm. Alexander led Eleanor onto the floor, and for the length of one dance, the entire room watched a duke choose the very woman who had just been humiliated in front of them all. Eleanor was not a graceful dancer. She had never been taught properly, for her aunt considered dancing lessons a waste of money on a girl with no prospects. But Alexander adjusted his steps to hers without seeming to notice, guiding her so gently that she barely felt her own missteps. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly, once she trusted her voice not to shake. "No," he agreed, "I did not have to. I wanted to." "Why?" she asked, before she could stop herself. He considered the question for a moment, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because your aunt was wrong," he said simply, "and because someone in this room needed to say so, even without words." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, something she had kept locked away since her parents died, and she had gone to live under her aunt's roof. It was not quite hope. She did not trust hope, not anymore, but it was something close to it, warm and unfamiliar. When the dance ended, Alexander bowed again and thanked her, then returned to the edge of the room, leaving Eleanor standing in the middle of the floor with every eye still upon her, though the nature of their attention had changed entirely. Where there had been mockery, there was now curiosity, even envy. Lady Prudence's face had gone the color of old parchment. Eleanor did not wait to see what her aunt would say. She excused herself and walked toward the garden doors, needing air, needing distance from the whispers already beginning to multiply behind her. The garden was cool and dark, lit only by a few lanterns strung along the paths. Eleanor walked until the noise of the ballroom faded into a low hum behind her, then stopped beside a stone bench and pressed a hand to her chest, willing her heart to slow. She did not hear footsteps until they were close. "Forgive me if I have intruded," Alexander said, standing a respectful distance away. "I saw you leave and wished to be certain you were well." "I am well," Eleanor said, though her voice betrayed her. He studied her for a long moment. "Your aunt speaks of you as though she despises you," he said carefully. "Yet you did not weep, and you did not argue. You simply stood still and let the words pass over you. That takes more strength than most people possess." "I have had practice," Eleanor admitted. "That should not be something a person has to practice," he said, and there was an edge in his voice now, quiet but unmistakable. Eleanor looked at him properly then, taking in the details she had missed in the ballroom's confusion. He was younger than she had expected for a duke, perhaps 30, with a face that seemed built for seriousness but softened when he looked at her. There was no cruelty in him, no calculation. He looked at her the way no one had looked at her in years, as though she were simply a person worth seeing. "May I ask why you are here tonight, Your Grace?" she said, Forgive me, but dukes rarely attend country assemblies such as this one. My family has old ties to this county, he said. My mother grew up not far from here, and I promised her I would call on old friends while I was in the area. I did not expect the evening to hold anything of interest beyond polite conversation and weak wine. And now? She asked. Now, he said. I find myself glad I came. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm again, though this time the heat was not from shame. She looked away, toward the dark shapes of the hedges, uncertain how to respond to a kindness so plainly offered. You should return inside, she said finally. My aunt will already be inventing stories about why I disappeared, and your absence will only add fuel to her imagination. Alexander smiled, the first true smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, softening the seriousness into something warmer. Let her imagine what she likes, he said. I find I do not much care what your aunt thinks of anything. He offered his arm. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before taking it, and together they walked back toward the light and noise of the ballroom, though neither of them hurried. Inside, the assembly had resumed its usual rhythm, but the atmosphere had shifted. Guests who had never spared Eleanor a glance now watched her with new interest as she returned on the Duke's arm. Lady Prudence stood near the refreshment table, her mouth pressed into a thin line, watching the two of them with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. It was not simply anger. There was something colder beneath it, something calculating. Alexander released Eleanor's arm at the edge of the dance floor and bowed once more. I hope we shall meet again, Miss Whitmore, he said. I hope so too, she replied, and meant it more than she had meant anything in a long time. He left soon after, and Eleanor watched him go, aware that something in her life had shifted, though she could not yet say what. Her aunt found her within minutes, gripping her arm with fingers like claws and steering her toward a quiet corner. Do not think this changes anything, Lady Prudence hissed. A duke's momentary kindness means nothing. Men like that dance with plain girls to be seen as generous, and then they forget them by morning. You would do well to remember your place before you embarrass this family further. Eleanor did not answer. She simply looked at her aunt with a calm she had not possessed an hour earlier, a calm born from the memory of a duke's steady eyes and the words he had spoken in the garden. That night, riding home in the carriage while her aunt complained bitterly about the evening's events, Eleanor stared out at the passing darkness and allowed herself, for the first time in years, to imagine that her life might hold more than her aunt's contempt and the narrow, joyless future that had been mapped out for her. She did not know yet how much her aunt would fight to prevent that future from arriving. She did not know how far Lady Prudence would go, or what secrets waited to be uncovered in the months ahead. She knew only that a duke had looked at her as though she mattered, and that for the first time since her parents' deaths, she had something worth holding on to. Somewhere beyond the dark hedgerows and quiet fields, Alexander Vane rode back toward his own estate, his thoughts lingering on a woman with steady eyes and a spine of quiet iron, a woman who had been told all her life that she was worth nothing, and who had proven, in a single evening, exactly how wrong that judgment was. Neither of them could have guessed how quickly Lady Prudence would move to keep them apart, nor how much would be revealed before the truth of Eleanor's own past came to light. But that night, under a sky full of distant stars, something had begun that neither cruelty nor scheming would easily undo. Back at the estate, Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs to her small room at the end of the hallway, the same room she had occupied since she was 12 years old, when a fever had taken both her parents within a single week and left her in her aunt's care. The room was plain, with a single window overlooking the stable yard, a narrow bed, and a washstand with a chipped basin. It had never troubled her before. Tonight, for reasons she could not fully explain, the bareness of it felt sharper, as though she were seeing her own life clearly for the first time in years. She sat on the edge of the bed and unpinned her hair slowly, replaying the evening in her mind. She thought of her aunt's voice, sharp and public, designed to wound as deeply as possible in front of witnesses. She thought of the silence that followed, the kind of silence that pressed down on a person until they could hardly breathe. And then she thought of footsteps crossing the ballroom floor, unhurried and certain, and a voice asking for a dance as though it were the most natural request in the world. She did not know what to make of Alexander Vane. Dukes did not simply appear at country assemblies and rescue overlooked young women from humiliation without reason. Perhaps her aunt was right, and it had meant nothing to him beyond a moment's charity, a small kindness performed and then forgotten by morning. Men of his rank moved through worlds Eleanor could barely imagine, filled with grand houses and titled families and marriages arranged for advantage rather than affection. A woman like her, with no fortune and a family name tarnished by her aunt's constant complaints about the cost of keeping her, had no real place in that world. And yet she could not forget the way he had looked at her in the garden, as though her answers actually mattered to him, as though he were genuinely curious about the person standing in front of him rather than performing politeness for the sake of appearances. No one had looked at her that way in a very long time, not since her father used to sit with her by the fire in the evenings, asking about her day, listening as though every small thing she said held some importance. Eleanor blew out her candle and lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar creak of the old house settling around her. Downstairs, she could hear her aunt's voice still going, complaining to the housekeeper about the evening, about the expense of Eleanor's gown, about the scandal of a duke choosing to dance with a girl who had nothing to offer him. The words no longer stung the way they once had. Tonight, for the first time, Eleanor found she could set them aside and think instead of stormy gray eyes and a voice that had called her aunt wrong in front of an entire room. She fell asleep, still turning the evening over in her mind, unaware that across the county, in a grand house she had never seen, Alexander Vane sat awake as well, staring into a dying fire, thinking of a woman who had refused to weep, refused to argue, and had simply stood still and endured, with a dignity that struck him more deeply than any beauty or fortune ever could have. Morning came too soon, bringing with it the ordinary demands of the household and the sharp edge of her aunt's temper, worn thin by a sleepless night of wounded pride. Eleanor rose before dawn, as she always did, to help with the tasks her aunt considered beneath a proper lady, but suitable enough for a niece who ate at her table, without contributing a fortune of her own. Eleanor said nothing about the Duke, though she carried the memory of him through every task like a small, private warmth. She did not yet know that a letter would arrive within days, nor that her quiet, uneventful life was about to change in ways she could not yet imagine. 3 days after the assembly, a letter arrived at the Whitmore estate bearing a wax seal Eleanor did not recognize, though her aunt certainly did. Lady Prudence snatched it from the housekeeper's hands before Eleanor could reach the front hall, her eyes narrowing as she read the crest pressed into the wax. Her face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, calculation, and finally something colder and more determined. "This is addressed to you," she said, holding the letter out to Eleanor as though it burned her fingers. "From Ashcombe." Eleanor's heart quickened as she took the letter and broke the seal. Inside, in a firm, elegant hand, Alexander Vane had written that he intended to call upon the Whitmore household the following week, as his family held old business with the estate that required attention, and that he hoped Miss Whitmore would be present to discuss matters of mutual interest to both families. The letter said nothing overtly personal. It gave Lady Prudence no grounds for complaint, no scandal to invent, but Eleanor understood, reading between the careful lines, that this was no ordinary matter of business. This was Alexander finding a reason, a proper and respectable reason, to see her again. Her aunt understood it too. "I do not know what game that man is playing," Lady Prudence said, pacing the small parlor with quick, agitated steps, "but I will not have this family made a laughingstock twice in one season. Dukes do not court penniless nieces, Eleanor. Whatever he wants, it is not marriage, and you would do well to remember that before you make a fool of yourself hoping otherwise." Eleanor said nothing, though she folded the letter carefully and kept it close for the rest of the day, reading it again that night by candlelight until she had memorized every line. When Alexander arrived the following week, he came in a plain carriage without ceremony, dressed simply, and greeted Lady Prudence with perfect courtesy despite the chill in her welcome. He spoke of old ties between the Vane and Whitmore families, of a small parcel of land whose boundaries had never been properly settled between their grandfathers, and of his wish to resolve the matter now that he had taken over the management of his estates. It was, Eleanor suspected, entirely invented, or at the very least greatly exaggerated. But her aunt, ever conscious of appearances and unable to refuse a duke's request without risking further embarrassment, allowed the visit to proceed, hovering nearby with poorly disguised suspicion while Alexander and Eleanor walked the garden paths to discuss the supposed boundary dispute. Once they were far enough from the house that Lady Prudence's presence at the window no longer mattered, Alexander's businesslike manner softened. "Forgive the invented excuse," he said, a faint smile touching his mouth. "I could think of no other way to see you again without causing your aunt more distress than necessary." "There is no boundary dispute then," Eleanor said, though she had already guessed as much. "None that I am aware of," he admitted. "Though I confess I did have my steward look into the old land records this week, in case your aunt asks for proof. I did not wish to be caught in an outright falsehood." Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, surprising herself with the sound of it. It had been so long since something had struck her as genuinely funny that the laugh felt almost foreign in her throat. "You went to a great deal of trouble," she said, "for a woman with no fortune and no prospects, or so I am told daily." Alexander's expression grew serious. "I have heard a great many things said about fortune and prospects in my life," he said. "Most of them said by people who valued neither kindness nor character, only the size of a dowry or the grandness of a name. I find I have little patience for such measurements anymore." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, past a small pond where ducks drifted lazily across the surface, and Eleanor found herself telling him things she had never told anyone, about her parents, about the fever that had taken them both within the same terrible week, about the years since spent in her aunt's house feeling like an unwanted guest in what should have been her own family. "I do not remember much kindness," she admitted. "My aunt reminds me constantly that she took me in out of duty, not affection, and that I owe her a debt I can never repay. I have learned not to expect much from people." "And yet you did not weep at the assembly," Alexander said quietly. "You did not argue or defend yourself. You simply endured, with more grace than most people manage in far easier circumstances." "I have had a great deal of practice enduring," Eleanor said, echoing what she had told him in the garden days before. "That should not be a skill anyone needs to practice," he said again, and this time his voice carried something rawer, something almost angry on her behalf. Eleanor glanced at him, curious. "And what of you, Your Grace?" she asked. "What burdens does a duke carry that require such understanding of endurance?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "My father died when I was 20, he said finally. "I inherited the title far sooner than I expected, along with debts he had hidden from everyone, including my mother. I spent years rebuilding what he had nearly destroyed, learning to manage estates and tenants and accounts I never wanted to understand, all while being told constantly that a duke must marry well, must secure the family's future, must think of nothing beyond duty and advantage." "And have you?" she asked. "Secured the family's future, as expected?" "Not yet," he said, and there was something in the way he looked at her when he said it that made her pulse quicken. They were interrupted before either of them could say more by the sound of Lady Prudence calling from the house, her voice sharp with impatience, summoning Eleanor back inside before propriety could be questioned any further. Alexander walked her back toward the house, and at the garden gate, he paused. "I would like to call again," he said, "properly, if your aunt permits it, though I suspect she will find reasons to object regardless of what I say." "I would like that too," Eleanor said, and meant it entirely. He bowed and took his leave, and Eleanor stood watching his carriage disappear down the drive, her heart caught somewhere between hope and fear, unsure which feeling to trust more. Her aunt was waiting the moment she stepped inside, arms crossed, expression thunderous. "I will not have you making eyes at a duke over some invented land dispute," Lady Prudence said. "I have written to your cousin Charlotte's family this very morning. She is coming to stay with us for the season, and I expect you to remember your place once she arrives. Charlotte has beauty and connections you will never possess, and any sensible man will see the difference between you the moment they stand in the same room." Eleanor did not answer, though something in her chest tightened at the mention of her cousin's name. She had met Charlotte only a handful of times over the years, always briefly, always with her aunt praising the girl's golden curls and easy charm in painful contrast to Eleanor's own plainer features and quieter manner. "You may go to your room," Lady Prudence said, waving a dismissive hand. "And do not think this visit has changed anything. A duke's curiosity fades quickly enough once something prettier catches his eye." Eleanor climbed the stairs slowly, her aunt's words settling over her like a familiar, unwelcome blanket. She told herself she would not let them matter, that Alexander's kindness in the garden had felt too genuine to be mere curiosity, easily discarded. But doubt, once planted, had a way of taking root even in soil that seemed otherwise firm. That night, she sat by her window long after the candle had burned low, watching the dark shapes of the trees sway beyond the glass, and wondered whether her aunt might, for once, be right. Perhaps a duke's attention was nothing more than a passing amusement, a small kindness offered to a girl who had never known one before. Perhaps Charlotte's arrival would prove exactly what Lady Prudence predicted, that beauty and connection would always outweigh whatever quiet understanding had begun to grow between Eleanor and Alexander, in a garden full of drifting ducks and half-invented business. But even as the doubt crept in, Eleanor found herself returning to the memory of his voice, steady and certain, telling her that he had little patience for measurements of fortune and beauty. She held on to that memory as she finally fell asleep. Charlotte arrived 4 days later in a hired carriage laden with trunks, announcing her presence with a bright laugh that carried through the front hall long before Eleanor saw her face. She was, as Lady Prudence had promised, strikingly pretty, with golden curls arranged in the latest fashion, and a gown clearly chosen with far more expense than anything in Eleanor's own modest wardrobe. Charlotte embraced Eleanor warmly enough, though her eyes moved quickly over her cousin's plain dress and simple hair, cataloging the differences between them with the same swift, practiced judgment their aunt had spent years teaching her to make. "You must be so pleased I have come," Charlotte said, settling into the best chair in the parlor as though she had always belonged there. "Aunt Prudence tells me you have caught the attention of a duke, though I confess I find it difficult to imagine. Dukes are notoriously particular, are they not?" Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral. "Perhaps he simply values kindness over particulars," she said. Charlotte laughed, not unkindly, but with the easy confidence of a woman who had never once doubted her own worth in a room. "How sweet," she said. "Well, I am sure whatever attention he has shown you was simply politeness. Dukes are taught politeness from the cradle, after all. It would be foolish to mistake manners for genuine interest." Lady Prudence, listening from the doorway, smiled with obvious satisfaction at her niece's words, and Eleanor understood then that the two of them had likely discussed this very conversation before Charlotte ever set foot in the house. She excused herself soon after, retreating to the garden where she could think without her aunt's triumphant gaze following her every move. The days that followed proved difficult in ways Eleanor had not fully anticipated. Lady Prudence arranged small gatherings and invited neighboring families to tea, always seating Charlotte in the place of honor, always steering conversation toward her cousin's accomplishments, her skill at the pianoforte, her graceful dancing, her cheerful wit. Eleanor was rarely asked to contribute beyond pouring tea or fetching whatever her aunt required, and she bore it quietly, as she had borne so much else, though the constant comparison wore at her more than she cared to admit. Alexander called again within the week, as he had promised, though this time Lady Prudence ensured Charlotte was present for the entire visit, introducing her at every opportunity with obvious pride. Eleanor watched from a quiet corner as her aunt guided Charlotte through polite conversation with the Duke, watched Charlotte laugh at his mild jokes and compliment his horses and his estate with practiced ease, and felt something cold settle in her stomach despite her best efforts to remain composed. But Alexander's attention did not waver the way Lady Prudence clearly hoped it would. He answered Charlotte's questions with polite brevity and returned, again and again, to include Eleanor in the conversation, asking her opinion on matters Charlotte had no interest in discussing, recalling small details from their previous conversations that made it clear he had been listening closely and remembering. "Miss Whitmore mentioned once that she preferred walking to riding," he said at one point, glancing toward Eleanor with the faintest smile. "I wonder if the garden path near the old oak might suit a quiet walk better than another hour indoors." Charlotte's smile faltered only slightly, quickly smoothed over, but Lady Prudence's expression darkened considerably. She could hardly object without appearing rude in front of a duke, and so the small party moved outside, though she made certain to walk close beside Charlotte the entire time, leaving Eleanor and Alexander only a few private words exchanged in passing. "You did not need to do that," Eleanor murmured as they paused near the old oak tree, momentarily out of earshot of the others. "I know," Alexander said, "but I find I would rather spend my time with someone who speaks honestly with me than with someone who has clearly rehearsed every compliment before arriving." Eleanor felt a small, unguarded smile break through despite herself. "My cousin is not unkind," she said, "only raised to believe that charm is the only currency worth possessing." "And you were raised to believe you possessed no currency at all," Alexander said quietly, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I think you were taught wrong, on both counts." Before Eleanor could answer, Lady Prudence's voice called out, sharp and insistent, summoning them back to the group, and the moment dissolved as quickly as it had formed. But Eleanor carried his words with her for the rest of the day, turning them over in her mind like a small, precious object she was not yet ready to examine too closely, for fear of what she might find if she looked directly at the hope beginning to grow inside her. The rumor reached Eleanor before she understood where it had come from, though she suspected the truth of it almost immediately. It began with sideways glances at church, whispers that stopped abruptly whenever she drew near, and a coldness from women who had, only weeks before, greeted her with polite indifference at worst. By the time Eleanor learned the full shape of what was being said about her, the damage had already spread through half the county. The story, as it traveled from parlor to parlor, claimed that Eleanor Whitmore had once been discovered in a compromising situation with a stable hand at a neighboring estate, and that her aunt had only kept the matter quiet out of a sense of family duty rather than any genuine belief in her niece's innocence. It was, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty, entirely false. She had never so much as spoken privately with any of the stable hands at any estate in the county. But falsehood mattered little, once it found eager ears, and the story grew more detailed with each retelling, gathering invented specifics that made it sound increasingly credible to those who wished to believe the worst. Eleanor first heard the full version from the housekeeper, who reported it with obvious discomfort, clearly unwilling to be the one delivering such news but equally unwilling to let her mistress remain ignorant of what was being said. "Where did this begin?" Eleanor asked, though a cold certainty had already settled over her. The housekeeper hesitated. "They say it started with Lady Beatrice Fenwick," she admitted finally. "The Marchioness who visited your aunt last week for tea." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. She remembered the visit well, remembered sitting quietly in the corner of the parlor while her aunt entertained the Marchioness with an hour of gossip and complaint, remembered Lady Prudence's voice dropping low at one point as she leaned toward her guest with an expression of practiced concern. She had not been able to hear the words exchanged in that lowered voice. Now she understood exactly what her aunt had planted and precisely why. Confronting Lady Prudence directly proved as fruitless as Eleanor had expected. Her aunt denied everything with wide-eyed innocence, claiming she had no notion where such a vicious rumor could have originated, though her eyes held a satisfaction she could not quite hide beneath the performance of concern. "Perhaps," Lady Prudence suggested, her voice sweet with false sympathy, "this is simply the natural consequence of putting yourself forward with a man so far above your station. People talk, Eleanor. They always have, and they always will, particularly when a plain girl with no fortune suddenly attracts the interest of a duke. You cannot blame the county for wondering what she might have done to secure such attention." Eleanor left the room without responding, her hands trembling with a fury she rarely allowed herself to feel, let alone express. She understood now, with painful clarity, exactly what her aunt intended. If Eleanor's reputation could be sufficiently damaged, Alexander's interest would surely fade, whether from his own doubts or from pressure among his own family and circle to avoid scandal. Charlotte, untouched by any such rumor, would remain the obvious, respectable choice. Word of the rumor reached Alexander within days, as Eleanor had feared it eventually would. He arrived at the Whitmore estate unannounced, his expression grim in a way she had not seen before, and requested a private word with Eleanor in the garden, away from Lady Prudence's ever-watchful presence. "I have heard what is being said about you," he told her without preamble, once they were far enough from the house. "I want you to know that I do not believe a word of it." Relief flooded through Eleanor so suddenly that her eyes stung with unexpected tears, which she blinked back fiercely, unwilling to appear weak even in front of someone who had shown her nothing but kindness. "It is not true," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "None of it. I have never spoken with any stable hand beyond simple courtesy, and I have certainly never behaved in any manner that could be called improper." "I know," Alexander said firmly. "I did not need to ask, though I am glad to hear you say it directly. I have spent enough time in your company to know the shape of your character, and it bears no resemblance to the woman described in this ridiculous story." "Then why do you look so troubled?" Eleanor asked, for despite his reassurance, something clearly weighed on him. "Because rumors such as these rarely stay contained," Alexander said, his jaw tight. "My mother has already heard whispers of it, passed along by a cousin eager to share gossip regardless of its truth. She has written asking whether I intend to continue calling on you, given the damage such association might do to both our reputations, should the story spread further before it can be disproven." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. "And what did you tell her?" she asked quietly, bracing herself for an answer she feared might confirm every doubt her aunt had worked so hard to plant. "I told her the truth," Alexander said, meeting her eyes directly. "I told her that the rumor is false, that I intend to continue calling on Miss Whitmore regardless of what small minds choose to whisper, and that I would thank her not to give credence to gossip she has not bothered to investigate for herself." The relief that swept through Eleanor this time was so overwhelming that she had to look away, blinking rapidly, before she could trust herself to speak again. "Thank you," she managed finally. "You need not thank me for simply telling the truth," Alexander said, his voice gentler now. "Eleanor, I intend to make my position known publicly, at the assembly next week. I will not have you subjected to whispers and sideways glances while I remain silent. If there is talk to be had, let it be honest talk, grounded in what is actually true, rather than what is convenient for those who wish to see you diminished." Eleanor searched his face, uncertain she had understood him correctly. "What do you mean to say?" she asked carefully. "I mean to dance with you again, publicly, and to make it clear to anyone watching that I hold you in the highest regard," he said. "I mean to give your aunt's rumor nowhere to hide, by standing beside you, rather than at a careful, respectable distance. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "Your family," she began. "Your mother's concerns." "My mother will come to see reason," Alexander said, "or she will not, and I will manage that difficulty as it comes. I did not become duke to spend my life bending to gossip and fear of scandal. I watched my father do exactly that for years, sacrificing everything that mattered to preserve an appearance of respectability, and it cost him more than any scandal ever could have. I do not intend to repeat his mistakes." They stood together in silence for a long moment, the weight of his words settling between them. Eleanor thought of all the years she had spent believing herself unworthy of notice, unworthy of defense, and found it strange and almost unbearable to stand now beside a man willing to risk his own reputation to defend hers. The assembly, when it arrived, proved every bit as tense as Eleanor had anticipated. Whispers followed her from the moment she entered the hall on her aunt's arm, Charlotte trailing close behind in a gown far finer than Eleanor's own modest dress. Lady Prudence wore an expression of carefully arranged concern, playing the role of a devoted aunt burdened by a scandalous niece with practiced skill, accepting sympathetic glances from other matrons with a martyred sigh. Alexander arrived later, and the moment he crossed the room to Eleanor's side, ignoring Charlotte's bright greeting entirely, the whispers shifted in tone, uncertainty replacing the earlier confident gossip. "Miss Whitmore," he said, bowing formally before the assembled guests. "Might I have this dance?" Eleanor placed her hand in his, and this time, as they moved onto the floor together, she felt none of the fear that had gripped her at their first dance weeks before. She felt only a steady, growing certainty that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Partway through the dance, Alexander leaned slightly closer, his voice pitched low enough for only her to hear. "I have also taken the liberty of speaking with Lady Fenwick directly this evening," he said. "She has agreed to correct the rumor publicly, once I explained rather plainly how such careless gossip reflects on her own judgment and reputation, should it prove false, as it will." Eleanor nearly stumbled at the news, catching herself only through Alexander's steady hold. "You spoke with the Marchioness directly?" she asked, astonished. "I did," he said, a faint, satisfied smile touching his mouth. "Some conversations are best had honestly and without delay." The dance ended, and true to his word, Lady Beatrice Fenwick made her way through the crowd within the hour, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear as she remarked, with practiced casualness, that she had clearly been mistaken in repeating an unfounded story, and that Miss Whitmore's character was in fact beyond reproach. The correction spread nearly as quickly as the original rumor had, and Eleanor felt the atmosphere in the room shift once more, suspicion giving way to something closer to grudging respect. Lady Prudence's carefully constructed performance of martyred concern crumbled visibly as the evening wore on, her expression growing tighter with every guest who approached to offer Eleanor a kind word or an apologetic smile. Charlotte, for her part, watched the proceedings with an expression Eleanor could not quite read, somewhere between disappointment and reluctant admiration. But the evening's triumph was short-lived. Near its end, as guests began preparing to depart, a servant approached Alexander quietly and delivered a folded note. Eleanor watched his expression change as he read it, the color draining slightly from his face. "What is it?" she asked, alarm rising in her chest. "My mother," he said, folding the note carefully. "She has taken ill, quite suddenly. I must return home tonight." "I am so sorry," Eleanor said, reaching instinctively for his hand before catching herself and pulling back, aware of the eyes still watching them. Alexander caught her hand anyway, holding it briefly, his grip firm and warm. "I will return as soon as I am able," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Eleanor, whatever happens in the coming days, know that nothing I have said to you tonight was said lightly. I meant every word." Before she could answer, before she could find words adequate to the sudden fear gripping her chest, he was gone, moving quickly through the crowd toward the door, leaving Eleanor standing alone amid the murmuring guests, uncertain when she would see him again, or what troubles awaited him at his family's estate. Lady Prudence appeared at her side moments later, her earlier defeat already hardening into fresh calculation. "Well," she said, her voice carrying a satisfaction that made Eleanor's stomach twist. "It seems even a duke's convictions crumble the moment his family requires him elsewhere. We shall see how much his promises are worth once he is home, surrounded by those who will remind him precisely what is owed to his name and his title." Eleanor said nothing, though as the carriage carried her home through the darkness, she found herself praying, for the first time in years, that something good might actually be allowed to last. The days that followed passed slowly, marked by an unfamiliar quiet that Eleanor found harder to bear than any open cruelty from her aunt. No further word came from Alexander, and though she told herself this meant nothing beyond the demands of caring for an ill mother, doubt crept in regardless, fed by her aunt's constant needling remarks over breakfast and tea. "You see how quickly it fades," Lady Prudence said one morning, buttering her toast with deliberate calm. "A week of silence, and already you look as though the world has ended. I did warn you, Eleanor. Men of his rank do not answer to promises made in the heat of a ballroom. Once he is home, surrounded by his mother's expectations and his family's advisors, he will remember precisely what is owed to a name like Ashcombe. It will not be owed to you." Eleanor kept her eyes on her plate and said nothing, though the words settled into her chest like small stones, adding weight to an anxiety she was already struggling to carry. She busied herself with the household tasks her aunt assigned her: mending, sewing, helping in the kitchen, anything that might keep her hands occupied, and her mind from wandering too often toward the ducal estate, and whatever troubles had called Alexander away so suddenly. Charlotte, surprisingly, proved a small source of comfort during those uncertain days. She found Eleanor alone in the garden one afternoon, sitting on the same stone bench where Alexander had once found her after the assembly, and settled beside her without invitation. "You truly care for him, do you not?" Charlotte said, not unkindly, studying her cousin's face with unusual seriousness. "I do," Eleanor admitted, too tired to deny it any longer. Charlotte was quiet for a moment, plucking absently at the fabric of her sleeve. "I confess I was jealous, at first," she said finally. "I have always been told I would make the better match, prettier, more accomplished, more suited to a life among the nobility. It was strange to watch a duke look past all of that toward someone else entirely." "I am sorry if I have caused you any difficulty," Eleanor said, though she was not entirely sure what to make of her cousin's sudden honesty. "You have not," Charlotte said, shaking her head. "If anything, I have begun to wonder whether Aunt Prudence has done either of us any favors, teaching us to measure our worth only by what men choose to notice. I am tired of performing charm for strangers who care nothing for who I actually am beneath it. Perhaps there is something to be said for a man who looks past the performance entirely." Eleanor studied her cousin, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice, a vulnerability she had never before glimpsed beneath Charlotte's easy confidence. "Perhaps we are more alike than either of us realized," she said quietly. Charlotte offered a small, genuine smile, the first Eleanor had ever received from her without calculation behind it. "Perhaps," she agreed. The moment of unexpected closeness was interrupted by Lady Prudence's voice calling from the house, summoning both girls inside for some fresh scheme or errand, and the two of them rose together, an unspoken understanding passing between them that had not existed a week before. That evening, alone in her room, Eleanor took out the letter Alexander had first sent her, the one requesting his initial visit under the guise of a boundary dispute, and read it again by candlelight, searching the careful, elegant script for some reassurance she could not quite find in the words alone. She thought of his hand holding hers at the assembly, his voice low and urgent as he promised to return, and told herself, again and again, that his silence meant nothing beyond the ordinary demands of a family crisis. But as another week passed without word, even Eleanor's carefully maintained hope began to waver. She overheard her aunt writing letters late into the evening, the scratch of the pen audible through the thin walls of the house, and though she could not read the contents, she suspected Lady Prudence was already moving to secure some alternative match for her, unwilling to wait patiently while a duke's attention remained uncertain. Eleanor did not yet know how right she was to worry, nor how quickly her aunt's schemes would take shape in the days ahead. She knew only that the quiet, once a comfort, had begun to feel like the held breath before a storm, and that whatever waited on the other side of Alexander's silence would test her far more severely than any rumor or public humiliation had managed to do so far. The man arrived on a gray afternoon, announced by Lady Prudence with an enthusiasm Eleanor had rarely seen her aunt display for anything. Mr. Edmund Harlow was, by all outward appearances, a perfectly respectable gentleman, a widower of considerable means with a comfortable estate 2 counties away, and a reputation for steady, unremarkable habits. He was also, Eleanor noted the moment he entered the parlor, at least 20 years her senior, with a cold, assessing gaze that reminded her uncomfortably of a merchant inspecting livestock, rather than a man meeting a prospective bride. "Mr. Harlow has expressed a most flattering interest in you, Eleanor," Lady Prudence announced, her voice bright with false warmth. "He is a man of excellent standing, and given the unfortunate rumors that have circulated about you this season, I think you will agree he shows considerable generosity in overlooking such talk entirely." Eleanor understood immediately what her aunt intended. 3 weeks had passed since the assembly, 3 weeks of silence from Alexander that had grown heavier and more frightening with each passing day, and Lady Prudence had clearly decided to wait no longer for a duke's uncertain affections when a more reliable, if far less desirable match had presented itself. Mr. Harlow spoke little during the visit, content to let Lady Prudence carry the conversation, occasionally directing a comment toward Eleanor that felt less like genuine interest and more like a formality to be completed, before matters proceeded to their inevitable conclusion. He asked about her skills in household management, her willingness to relocate to his estate, her opinion on matters of thrift and economy, questions that made Eleanor feel less like a woman being courted and more like a position being filled. When he finally departed, Lady Prudence turned to Eleanor with an expression of triumphant satisfaction that made Eleanor's stomach twist with dread. "He has agreed to call again next week," Lady Prudence said, "to formally request your hand. I expect you to accept without argument, Eleanor. This is a far better outcome than you deserve, given the scandal you nearly brought upon this family, and far more security than you will ever find waiting on a duke who has clearly lost interest. I do not wish to marry Mr. Harlow," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. Lady Prudence's expression hardened instantly. "Your wishes are not the matter at hand," she said sharply. "I have given you a home for years, at considerable expense and inconvenience, and I will not continue to do so indefinitely while you wait for a man who has clearly abandoned whatever passing fancy he once held for you. You will marry Mr. Harlow, or you will find yourself another home entirely, one considerably less comfortable than the roof I have provided you all these years." Eleanor left the room without further argument, retreating to her small bedroom where she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, hands trembling, mind racing through options that all seemed to lead nowhere. She had no fortune of her own, no other family willing to take her in, no means of supporting herself independent of her aunt's grudging charity. The threat of being cast out was not an idle one, and Eleanor understood with cold clarity exactly how precarious her position truly was. But as she sat there, turning the situation over and over in her mind, something shifted inside her. A small, stubborn spark of the same quiet courage that had allowed her to stand still and unweeping through her aunt's public humiliation weeks before. She thought of Alexander's words in the garden, his insistence that she had been taught wrong about her own worth, and found that despite everything, despite the silence and the fear and her aunt's threats, she could not make herself believe that marrying Edmund Harlow was truly her only path forward. The following days passed in tense anticipation, Lady Prudence making elaborate preparations for Mr. Harlow's return visit, ordering a new gown for Eleanor to wear, one chosen entirely for its practicality rather than any consideration of Eleanor's own taste, and instructing her repeatedly on the proper responses to give when he formally requested her hand. "You will smile," Lady Prudence said, adjusting the collar of the new gown with sharp, impatient tugs. "You will thank him graciously. You will not mention the Duke, not even in passing, and you will certainly not embarrass this family with any further foolish hopes of a match so far above your station." Eleanor said nothing, though inwardly she had already begun to form a decision, one that frightened her considerably, but felt, increasingly, like the only choice she could live with. Charlotte found her the evening before Mr. Harlow's expected return, sitting alone in the garden in the fading light, and settled beside her with the same quiet solidarity she had shown weeks before. "You do not have to accept him," Charlotte said quietly, without preamble. "Aunt Prudence says I have no other choice," Eleanor replied. Charlotte was silent for a moment, studying her cousin's face in the dim light. "There is always a choice," she said finally. "It is simply that some choices cost more than others. But Eleanor, I have watched you these past weeks, and I do not think you are a woman who has ever truly believed she had no choice at all, whatever Aunt Prudence tells you to believe." Eleanor looked at her cousin, surprised again by the depth of understanding Charlotte had begun to show in recent weeks, so different from the careless, practiced charm she had first arrived with. "What would you do, in my position?" Eleanor asked. "I do not know," Charlotte admitted honestly. "I have never had to make such a choice, not truly. But I know that if I loved someone the way you clearly love the Duke, I do not think I could make myself marry another man simply because Aunt Prudence found it convenient." The words settled something firmly in Eleanor's chest, a decision that had been forming slowly over the previous days, finally crystallizing into certainty. When Mr. Harlow arrived the following afternoon, dressed in his best coat, clearly prepared to formalize an arrangement he considered already settled, Eleanor met him in the parlor with a calm she had not expected herself capable of. Mr. Harlow, she said, before he could begin whatever prepared speech he had brought with him, I am grateful for your interest, but I cannot accept your proposal. I do not love you, and I do not believe you love me either. I think we both know this arrangement was built entirely on my aunt's convenience rather than any genuine affection between us, and I will not enter a marriage on such terms. The parlor fell into stunned silence. Mr. Harlow's expression shifted from confusion to mild offense, though Eleanor noted, with some surprise, a flicker of what might have been relief beneath his wounded pride. Lady Prudence, by contrast, went white with fury, rising from her chair so abruptly that her teacup clattered against its saucer. You will apologize to Mr. Harlow this instant, Lady Prudence said, her voice shaking with rage, and you will reconsider this foolishness before you ruin every remaining chance this family has of seeing you settled respectably. I will not, Eleanor said, and though her heart pounded fiercely in her chest, her voice did not waver. I would rather remain unmarried and uncertain of my future than bind myself to a man I do not love, simply to relieve you of an obligation you have never wanted to bear. Mr. Harlow rose stiffly, murmured a few brief formal words of farewell, and departed without further ceremony, clearly as relieved as he was affronted to escape the scene unfolding before him. The moment the door closed behind him, Lady Prudence turned on Eleanor with a fury Eleanor had never witnessed from her before, not even at the assembly. You ungrateful, foolish girl, Lady Prudence said, her voice rising to something close to a shout. Do you understand what you have done? Do you understand what you have thrown away, for the sake of a duke who has not written a single word to you in weeks? You will leave this house, Eleanor. I will not continue to shelter a girl so determined to destroy every opportunity I work to provide her. Eleanor stood her ground, though tears burned at the edges of her vision, tears she refused to let fall in front of her aunt. Then I will leave, she said quietly, and I will find my own way, whatever that costs me. But I will not marry a man I do not love simply to secure my place in a house where I have never truly been welcome. She turned and left the parlor before her aunt could respond further, retreating to her room to begin the frightening, uncertain task of considering what her life might look like beyond Lady Prudence's roof. She had little money saved, no clear prospects, and no certainty that Alexander's silence did not mean exactly what her aunt had predicted from the beginning. But something in her, some quiet, hard-won conviction, told her that this decision, whatever it cost her, was the right one. What Eleanor did not know, and could not have known, was the true reason behind Alexander's long silence. His mother's illness had proven far more serious than the brief note delivered at the assembly had suggested. A fever that left the Duchess weak and bedridden for nearly 2 weeks, during which Alexander had scarcely left her side, torn between his duties as her son and his growing longing to return to Eleanor's side. When the Duchess finally began to recover, she had used the quiet, private hours of her convalescence to press her son relentlessly on the subject of marriage, reminding him at every opportunity of his duty to the Ashcombe name, of the advantageous matches available to a man of his rank, of the risks he courted in pursuing a penniless country gentlewoman, with no fortune to offer the family in return. I only wish to see you settled well, Alexander, his mother had said one evening, her voice still frail from illness but her will as sharp as ever. You are the last of our line. Whatever you decide, I hope you will consider carefully what such a decision means, not only for yourself, but for everyone who depends upon this family's continued security. Alexander had listened to his mother's concerns with patience, understanding the fear that drove them even as he found himself unable to agree with her conclusions. He thought constantly of Eleanor during those weeks, of her quiet strength, her honesty, the way she had endured cruelty her entire life without ever allowing it to harden her into bitterness. He wrote to her twice during his mother's illness, only to tear both letters apart before sending them, uncertain how to explain the delay without alarming her further, uncertain too whether his mother's arguments carried more weight than his own growing certainty about what he wanted. It was a chance remark from his sister, Lucy, that finally settled the matter in his mind. She had visited during their mother's recovery, and one evening, finding her brother staring into the fire with the same distracted expression he had worn for weeks, she asked him plainly what troubled him. You are thinking of her, Lucy said, not really a question. The woman from the assembly. Mother has mentioned the rumors, and the delay in your correspondence. I do not know what to do, Alexander admitted, an unusual confession from a man who prided himself on decisiveness. Mother fears the match will damage the family. I fear that walking away from her will damage something far more important than any family name. Lucy studied her brother for a long moment. Then you already know your answer, she said simply. You are only afraid to act on it, because acting on it means disappointing Mother, and you have spent your whole life trying not to disappoint her. ever since father died and left you to hold everything together. But Alexander, you cannot spend your entire life proving your worth to people who measure worth only in titles and fortunes. If this woman is who you say she is worth more than any of that." Her words settled something firmly in Alexander's chest, the same quiet certainty he had felt in the garden weeks before, when he had told Eleanor that he had little patience for such measurements. He resolved that night to return to her as soon as his mother's health allowed, and to make his intentions known plainly, whatever resistance his family raised against it. But word of Mr. Harlow's courtship reached him only days later, carried by a distant cousin eager to share gossip, as such news always seemed to travel faster than anything Alexander himself managed to send. The report was garbled and incomplete, suggesting only that Lady Prudence Whitmore had arranged an advantageous match for her niece and intended to see it settled within the week. Alexander did not wait to learn more, nor did he pause to explain himself fully to his still recovering mother. He simply ordered his horse saddled and rode through the night, driven by a fear sharper than any he had known before, that he might arrive too late to stop a marriage that would take Eleanor from him permanently. She did not know, as she sat by her window that evening watching the last light fade from the sky, that at that very moment, many miles away, a rider was already crossing the dark countryside at a punishing pace, urgency driving him forward long before dawn, determined to reach her before it was too late, having finally resolved the crisis that had kept him away for so many agonizing weeks. The pounding of hooves on the drive woke Eleanor before dawn, followed almost immediately by urgent voices below and the sound of the front door being thrown open with such force that it struck the wall. She rose quickly, pulling a shawl around her shoulders, and reached the top of the stairs just in time to see Alexander standing in the front hall, still dressed in his riding clothes, mud splattered across his boots and coat, his hair disheveled from hours in the saddle. Lady Prudence stood before him in her nightgown, clutching a candle, her expression somewhere between outrage and confusion at the sudden intrusion. "Where is she?" Alexander demanded, his voice carrying an urgency Eleanor had never heard from him before. "I have heard she is to be married. I will not allow it, not without speaking to her first." "Eleanor," she said. "She has not married anyone," Lady Prudence began, clearly flustered by his sudden, dramatic arrival. "Your Grace, this is hardly the hour for—" "I am here," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying clearly down the staircase. Alexander looked up, and the relief that broke across his face at the sight of her was so plain, so unguarded, that Eleanor felt her own eyes fill with tears before she had taken a single step down the stairs. She descended slowly, aware of her aunt's furious gaze, aware of Charlotte appearing in the doorway of her own room above, drawn by the commotion, aware of nothing so much, in that moment, as the man standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching her with an expression that erased every doubt her aunt's cruel predictions had planted over the previous weeks. "You rode through the night," Eleanor said, reaching the bottom step. "I heard you were to marry another man," Alexander said, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion both. "I could not let that happen without telling you the truth of my own feelings first, whatever the cost, whatever my family's objections. Eleanor, I should have written sooner. I should have explained the delay, my mother's illness, the pressures placed upon me these past weeks. I let my silence speak for me, when it should never have been allowed to, and I am sorry for the fear I must have caused you." "I refused Mr. Harlow," Eleanor said quietly, "nearly a week ago now. I could not marry a man I did not love, whatever the cost to my own security." Alexander's expression shifted, relief mixing with something that looked almost like disbelief. "You refused him?" he repeated. "I did," Eleanor said. "My aunt has threatened to turn me out of the house entirely. I do not yet know where I will go, or how I will manage, but I could not bring myself to marry Edmund Harlow simply to secure my future at the expense of everything I actually wanted." Lady Prudence, who had been listening with growing horror as the scene unfolded before her, finally found her voice. "This is precisely the sort of foolishness I warned you about," she said sharply, turning toward Alexander. "Your Grace, I must protest this entire display. Arriving unannounced in the middle of the night, making declarations before the entire household, it is entirely improper, and frankly, I do not believe your intentions toward my niece are anything more than a passing fancy that will fade the moment you return to your family's expectations." Alexander turned to face Lady Prudence directly, and something in his expression, calm but utterly immovable, made even Eleanor's formidable aunt take a small step backward. "My intentions, Lady Prudence," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "are entirely honorable, and they are not new. I have admired your niece since the moment I watched her endure your public cruelty at the assembly, with more grace and dignity than I have seen from anyone in my own social circle, people raised from birth to believe themselves entitled to respect they have never earned. I have spent these past weeks fighting my own family's doubts on her behalf, and I do not intend to abandon that fight simply because you find it inconvenient. Lady Prudence's mouth opened and closed, clearly searching for a response adequate to the situation, but Alexander did not wait for one. He turned back to Eleanor, and in front of her aunt, her cousin, and the small gathering of servants who had been drawn by the commotion to the edges of the hall, he dropped to one knee. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, "I do not care what fortune you bring, or what your aunt believes you lack. I care only for your honesty, your courage, and the quiet strength I have watched you carry through every cruelty this world has offered you. I love you, and I would consider myself the most fortunate man alive if you would agree to become my wife." The hall fell utterly silent. Eleanor stared down at him, tears now falling freely, unable to speak for a long moment, as the weight of everything, the years of quiet endurance, the cruel words and public humiliations, the fragile hope she had carried these past weeks despite every reason to abandon it, rose up inside her all at once. "Yes," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper before growing stronger. "Yes, I will marry you." Alexander rose and closed the distance between them, and for a moment, propriety forgotten entirely, he took her hands in both of his expression full of a joy that transformed his usually serious features completely. Lady Prudence, however, was not finished. Watching her careful plans collapse entirely before her eyes, her face twisted with a bitterness that had clearly been building for weeks, she stepped forward with something sharp and desperate in her expression. "Before you commit yourself to this girl, Your Grace," she said, her voice cutting through the warmth of the moment like a blade, "perhaps you should know the truth of her parentage. Perhaps you should know that Eleanor is not entirely who she believes herself to be." The room went still again, this time with a different kind of tension. Eleanor felt Alexander's hand tighten around hers, though whether in reassurance or surprise, she could not tell. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor asked, her voice unsteady. Lady Prudence's smile was thin and cruel, the smile of a woman determined to wound even in the moment of her own defeat. "Your mother," she said, "was not always the respectable wife my brother believed her to be. Before she married him, she carried a connection to a family far grander than anyone in this county ever suspected, a connection she kept hidden out of shame, or perhaps out of fear of what such a revelation might cost her. I have known the truth for years, Eleanor, and I have kept it silent, believing it would only cause you pain to learn how little you truly know about your own history." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her, the sudden, dizzying sense that everything she believed about herself, her modest, unremarkable parentage, the quiet ordinariness of her family's history, might not be entirely true after all. "Tell me," she said, her voice barely steady. "Tell me everything, Aunt Prudence. You have kept this from me long enough." Lady Prudence hesitated, perhaps realizing too late that her final attempt to wound Eleanor had instead opened a door she could not easily close again, a door that would soon reveal far more than she had intended to share. "Very well," she said finally, her voice tight. "Your mother, Margaret, was not born into the modest family she claimed as her own. She was raised, for the first years of her life, by a woman who was not her true mother at all, but rather a nursemaid paid handsomely to keep her hidden away from a scandal that threatened to ruin a far grander family than either of us can properly imagine. Your true grandmother, Eleanor, was a lady of considerable rank, who bore a child outside of marriage and could not risk the exposure such a child would bring upon her family's name." Eleanor felt her legs weaken beneath her, and Alexander's arm came around her immediately, steadying her without a word. "How do you know this?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Your mother told me herself, many years ago, before you were born," Lady Prudence said. "We were close once, whatever you may find difficult to believe now. She confided in me during a moment of weakness, fearful that the truth might someday surface and damage her marriage to my brother. She made me promise never to speak of it, and I kept that promise, even after her death, even after I took you into my home. I told myself I was protecting you from a truth that could bring you nothing but pain, given you already had so little standing of your own. And the family," Eleanor pressed, her heart pounding, "the family my grandmother came from. Did she ever tell you a name?" Lady Prudence's eyes flicked, almost involuntarily, toward Alexander, and in that single glance, Eleanor understood before her aunt spoke another word. "Your grandmother was a Vane," Lady Prudence said quietly. "A cousin, several times removed, to the current Duke of Ashcomb's own family. She was sent away in disgrace before the scandal could touch the main line, and her child, your mother, was raised in secrecy, far from the family that might otherwise have claimed her. The silence that followed felt suspended, as though the entire household held its breath together. Alexander's grip on Eleanor's hand tightened, and when she looked up at him, she found his expression caught somewhere between shock and a dawning, almost wondering recognition. My grandmother spoke of a cousin, once, Alexander said slowly, as though piecing together a memory long buried. A woman sent away when I was still a boy, whose name was never mentioned again in polite company. I always assumed it was simply one of those old family scandals no one wished to discuss. I never imagined it might connect, all these years later, to someone I would come to love. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the sudden collapse of everything she had believed true about her own modest, unremarkable history. You are certain of this? She asked her aunt, though some part of her already knew the answer, could feel the truth of it settling into place alongside 100 small details she had never understood. Her mother's occasional distant sadness, the fine, delicate brooch she had kept locked away and never explained, the careful, guarded way she had always spoken of her own childhood. I am certain, Lady Prudence said, and for the first time in longer than Eleanor could remember, something like genuine regret crossed her aunt's face. I told myself I withheld this truth to protect you, Eleanor, but I think, if I am honest, I withheld it because it frightened me. The idea that you might have a claim to something grander than anything I could ever offer you, something that would make you, in the end, more than I ever allowed myself to consider you. Charlotte, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the hall throughout the entire exchange, stepped forward then, her expression fierce with an anger Eleanor had never seen from her gentle, easygoing cousin. You let her believe she was worthless, Charlotte said, turning on her mother with unusual sharpness. All these years, you let her believe she had no family worth claiming, no history worth knowing, when the truth was sitting locked away in your own memory the entire time. How could you? Lady Prudence had no answer, and for the first time since Eleanor had known her, her aunt looked genuinely diminished, stripped of the sharp, controlling confidence that had defined every interaction between them. Alexander turned Eleanor gently to face him, his expression steady despite the extraordinary revelations of the past few minutes. Whatever the truth of your family's history, he said quietly, it changes nothing about what I asked you tonight, or what I feel for you. I did not fall in love with a name or a bloodline, Eleanor. I fell in love with you, exactly as you are, long before any of this came to light. I know, Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion, but Alexander, if this is true, it means we are connected in ways neither of us understood. It means my mother's family and yours share old blood, however distant, however hidden. Then perhaps, Alexander said, a faint smile breaking through his shock, it means you belong in this family in more ways than one, and always have, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Eleanor allowed herself to lean into him then, exhausted by the weight of everything the night had brought, the fear and relief of his sudden arrival, the joy of his proposal, and now this staggering revelation about a history she had never known to question. There would be much to untangle in the days ahead, questions to ask, records to search, perhaps even a meeting with Alexander's own mother, who would need to be told the full truth before any wedding could proceed with her blessing. But for the first time and longer than Eleanor could remember, she did not face those uncertain days feeling alone, or unworthy, or afraid of what the future might reveal. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the tall windows of the front hall, the household slowly began to settle from the shock of the night's events. Servants who had gathered quietly at the edges of the room dispersed back to their duties, whispering among themselves about all they had witnessed. Lady Prudence retreated upstairs without another word, her earlier fury replaced by something quieter and more uncertain, as though she herself did not fully know what to make of the truth she had finally released after so many years of careful silence. Charlotte lingered a moment longer, studying Eleanor with an expression of warm, genuine happiness that held nothing of the earlier rivalry between them. I am glad for you, she said simply. Truly glad. Perhaps in time, we might discover we are better as friends than we ever were as rivals for anyone's attention. I would like that very much, Eleanor said, and meant it. Alexander, exhausted from his night ride and the weight of the revelations that followed, knew he could not remain much longer without arousing further talk, however little either of them now cared for propriety after the events of the evening. I must return home, he said reluctantly, brushing a strand of hair back from Eleanor's face with careful tenderness. My mother will need to hear all of this directly from me, and I suspect there is a great deal more to learn about the connection between our families before either of us fully understands what it means. Will she be angry? Eleanor asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. To learn that the woman you intend to marry carries a connection to a scandal her own family worked so hard to bury. I do not know, Alexander admitted honestly. But I think, in the end, she will be far more moved by the truth of who you are than by any old scandal, however it comes to light. My mother values honesty and courage above almost everything else, whatever fears she has allowed herself to entertain these past weeks. I believe, once she meets you properly, she will see exactly what I have seen since the night of that assembly. He pressed a gentle kiss to Eleanor's hand before finally taking his leave, promising to return within days once he had spoken with his mother and begun the careful work of uncovering the full truth of the connection between their families. Eleanor watched him ride away in the growing morning light, her heart full of a hope she had never quite allowed herself before, mixed now with a nervous uncertainty about everything the coming days might reveal. She climbed the stairs slowly afterward, her body aching with exhaustion from the sleepless, extraordinary night, and sat for a long while by her window, watching the sun rise fully over the fields beyond the house. So much had changed in the span of a single night, a proposal she had scarcely dared to hope for, and a revelation about her own history that reshaped everything she had believed true about her place in the world. She thought of her mother, gone now for so many years, and wondered what it must have cost her to carry such a secret in silence, to raise a daughter without ever revealing the grander, more complicated truth of her own birth. Eleanor found she felt no anger toward her, only a deep, aching sympathy for a woman who had clearly spent her life fearing exposure and judgment, the very things Eleanor herself had endured for so long under her aunt's roof, though for entirely different reasons. Whatever the coming days revealed, whatever questions remained to be answered about the exact nature of her connection to the Vane family, Eleanor understood one thing with absolute clarity as she finally allowed herself to rest. She was no longer the overlooked, unwanted girl her aunt had spent years insisting she was. She never truly had been. Not really. She had simply been waiting, without knowing it, for the truth of her own worth to finally come into the light. 3 days after the extraordinary night that had upended everything Eleanor believed about her own history, a carriage arrived at the Whitmore estate bearing the Ashcombe crest, and inside it, waiting with visible nervousness, sat the Duchess of Ashcombe herself. Eleanor had barely slept in the days since Alexander's departure, her mind circling endlessly through questions she could not answer alone. She had written to distant relatives, searched through her mother's few remaining possessions for any hint of the truth Lady Prudence had revealed, and found, tucked into the lining of an old jewelry box, a small portrait miniature of a woman she did not recognize, dressed in fashions decades out of date, wearing a delicate brooch identical to the one her own mother had kept locked away and never explained. When the Duchess descended from her carriage, Eleanor met her at the door with a curtsy, her heart pounding with an anxiety she could not entirely disguise, uncertain what reception awaited her from a woman whose own son had ridden through the night in open defiance of her wishes. But the Duchess's expression, when she finally looked at Eleanor directly, held none of the coldness Eleanor had feared. Instead, there was something searching in her gaze, something that softened gradually the longer she studied Eleanor's face. "You have her eyes," the Duchess said quietly, almost to herself. "Whose eyes, Your Grace?" Eleanor asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "My cousin's," the Duchess said. "Margaret." I have not spoken her name aloud in nearly 30 years. They spoke for hours that afternoon, seated together in the small parlor while Lady Prudence hovered anxiously nearby, clearly unsettled by the presence of a duchess in her modest home, and Charlotte listened quietly from a corner, absorbing every detail of a family history none of them had fully understood until now. The Duchess explained, with obvious pain, how her cousin Margaret had fallen in love with a young man far below her family's expectations, had borne a child in secret rather than face the family's fury, and had been quietly sent away, her child placed with a trusted nursemaid and raised under a different name entirely, far from the scandal that would have followed her otherwise. "We told ourselves we were protecting her," the Duchess admitted, her voice heavy with old regret. "In truth, I think we were protecting ourselves, our own family's reputation, at the cost of a young woman's entire life and happiness. I have thought of her often over the years, wondered what became of her, whether she found any peace at all after everything our family took from her." "She did find peace," Eleanor said softly, thinking of her mother's gentle presence, the quiet warmth of the years before her death, despite whatever private sorrows she had carried. "She married a good man, my father, and though we were never wealthy, I do not think she ever regretted the life she built for herself, however far it fell from what her own family once expected of her." The Duchess's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the small distance between them to take Eleanor's hand in both of hers. An unexpected gesture of tenderness from a woman Eleanor had feared might view her as nothing more than an inconvenient complication. "I am sorry," the Duchess said. "Sorry for what our family cost yours, and sorry for the doubts I allowed myself to voice about my son's affection for you. Before I understood any of this, you are not beneath this family, Eleanor. If anything, you have every right to claim a place within it that was denied to your mother far too long ago." Lady Prudence, listening from her position near the doorway, seemed to shrink slightly at these words, the full weight of her own long silence settling visibly upon her. She approached hesitantly once the Duchess finished speaking, her expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "I owe you an apology as well, Eleanor," Lady Prudence said, her voice quieter than Eleanor had ever heard it. "I told myself for years that keeping this secret protected you, but I think, in truth, I feared what it might mean, watching you claim a place I never believed either of us deserved. I have been cruel to you, in ways I cannot easily excuse, and I am sorry for the years I spent making you feel smaller than you ever truly were." Eleanor studied her aunt for a long moment, weighing the years of harsh words and public humiliation against this unexpected, hesitant apology. She did not know if she could forgive everything easily or quickly, but she found, to her own surprise, that she no longer wished to carry the weight of that old anger forward into whatever new life awaited her. "Thank you for telling the truth, eventually," Eleanor said finally. "I cannot forget everything that came before, but I do not wish to begin this new chapter of my life still carrying old bitterness either. Perhaps, in time, we might find a way towards something better between us." It was not a full forgiveness, not yet, but it was enough, for the moment, to ease some of the tension that had defined the household for so long. In the weeks that followed, the Duchess proved true to her word, dedicating considerable effort to uncovering whatever remained of the old family records that might confirm the connection between the two families beyond doubt. She wrote to a solicitor who had handled the Vane family's affairs decades earlier, an elderly man now retired but still sharp of memory, who recalled the quiet arrangements made for a young woman sent away in disgrace, and who was able to produce documents confirming the birth of a daughter, later placed with a nursemaid under circumstances carefully designed to avoid any public scandal. Eleanor read those documents with trembling hands, seeing her mother's true origins laid out in careful, formal handwriting for the first time. There was a strange grief in it, learning so late of a history her mother had never felt able to share, mixed with a quiet, growing pride in understanding at last where she had truly come from, and why certain small mysteries of her childhood, her mother's occasional distant sadness, the fine manners she had always insisted upon despite their modest circumstances, finally made sense in a way they never had before. The Duchess visited often during those weeks, and gradually, the careful formality between her and Eleanor softened into something warmer, almost familial. She shared stories of Margaret as a young girl, memories from childhood visits before the scandal had separated the cousins forever, small details that helped Eleanor form a fuller picture of the mother she had lost too young. In turn, Eleanor shared her own memories, quiet evenings by the fire, gentle lessons in kindness and patience, the particular way her mother had hummed while sewing, details the Duchess received with visible emotion, grateful for any fragment of the cousin she had lost to circumstance and silence so many years before. Alexander arrived that evening, having given his mother and Eleanor time to speak privately throughout the day, and found the household in a mood entirely different from the tense uncertainty of his last visit. His mother greeted him with a warm embrace and a quiet word of approval that made his shoulders relax visibly, the tension of the past uncertain weeks finally beginning to ease. "I believe I owe you both an apology," the Duchess said, looking between her son and Eleanor with genuine warmth. "I allowed old fears to cloud my judgment, fears about scandal and reputation that mattered far less, in the end, than the character of the woman standing before me. Eleanor, I would be honored to welcome you into this family, not as an obligation or a complication to be managed, but as the granddaughter of a cousin I loved dearly and failed, many years ago, to protect as I should have." The formal wedding, when it finally took place some months later, drew guests from across the county, many of them the very people who had once whispered cruel rumors about Eleanor's character, now eager to witness the union of the Duke of Ashcombe and the woman whose quiet dignity had, in the end, proven far more powerful than any scandal invented against her. Charlotte stood beside Eleanor throughout the ceremony, her role as a devoted friend and cousin fully established after months of growing closeness between them, a friendship neither of them could have predicted at the season's beginning. Lady Prudence attended as well, seated near the front alongside other family members, her expression during the ceremony unreadable, though Eleanor caught her dabbing quietly at her eyes during the exchange of vows, a small, unexpected sign of genuine emotion from a woman who had spent so many years guarding herself against any appearance of vulnerability. As Eleanor stood beside Alexander at the altar, dressed in a gown far finer than anything she had ever imagined wearing, she found herself thinking back to that first night at the assembly, her aunt's cruel words echoing across a silent ballroom, the shame that had threatened to overwhelm her entirely. She thought of how certain she had been, in that moment, that no gentleman would ever choose her, that her aunt's harsh judgment reflected some fundamental truth about her own worth. She understood now, standing before the assembled guests with Alexander's hand steady in hers, how wrong that judgment had been, not simply because a duke had chosen her, though that alone would have seemed impossible enough to the girl she had been that night, but because she had learned, through every hardship and every small act of courage along the way, that her worth had never truly depended on anyone else's recognition of it at all. When Alexander finally slipped the ring onto her finger, and the assembled guests rose in applause, Eleanor felt something settle deep within her, a peace she had not known she was capable of feeling, built not on the sudden elevation of her circumstances, though she was deeply grateful for the security and happiness that now lay ahead, but on the simple, hard-won knowledge that she had never needed anyone's permission to be worthy of love, respect, and a life built on her own quiet, unshakable strength. The carriage that carried them away from the church that afternoon passed the very assembly hall where the story had begun so many months before, and Eleanor found herself smiling at the memory now, grateful, in a strange way, that her aunt's cruel words had been spoken so publicly that night, for it had been in that moment of deepest humiliation that Alexander Vane had first seen something in her worth defending, worth pursuing, worth loving. She rested her head against Alexander's shoulder as the carriage carried them onward, toward a future neither of them could have fully predicted when they first met beneath the assembly's bright candlelight, and allowed herself, at last, to simply be happy, without fear, without doubt, and without any further need to prove her worth to anyone who had ever suggested she did not possess it. Their journey that evening led to a small estate near the coast, one of several properties belonging to the Ashcombe family, chosen by Alexander specifically for its quiet distance from the demands of society, a place where the two of them might spend the first weeks of their marriage, without the constant scrutiny that had followed Eleanor through so much of the preceding year. The house sat on a low cliff overlooking the sea, and Eleanor spent her first mornings there walking the shoreline, watching the waves roll steadily against the rocks below, feeling for the first time in her life that she belonged fully and completely to a place and a person, without condition or doubt. Alexander often joined her on these walks, and it was during one such morning, several weeks after the wedding, that he told her of his plans to establish a small trust, funded from his own private income, intended to support young women in circumstances similar to those Eleanor had once faced, women without fortune or family willing to advocate for them, who might otherwise find themselves pressured into unwanted marriages or turned out with nowhere to go. "I thought of you," he admitted, watching the waves rather than her face, perhaps slightly embarrassed by the depth of sentiment behind the gesture, of how close you came to losing everything, simply because you had no one willing to stand beside you when it mattered most. I would like to make certain other women in similar circumstances have somewhere to turn. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion, moved beyond words by the thoughtfulness of the gesture, and she took his hand, lacing her fingers through his as they continued their walk along the cliff's edge. "I think that is a wonderful idea," she said finally, "and I would like to help, if you will let me. I know better than most what such women need to hear, that their worth is not determined by their fortune, or their family's opinion of them, but by their own courage and character." Alexander smiled, the same warm, unguarded smile she had come to treasure over the months of their courtship. "Then it is settled," he said. "We shall build it together." They returned to the house as the sun began to set behind them, the sky turning shades of deep gold and burgundy over the water, and Eleanor paused at the top of the cliff path to look back at the view one final time before following her husband inside. She thought, as she often did in quiet moments like this one, of the frightened, humiliated girl who had stood frozen in a ballroom nearly a year before, certain that no one would ever choose her, certain that her aunt's harsh judgment defined the whole of her worth. That girl could never have imagined this life, this quiet, contented happiness built not on rescue alone, though Alexander's steady devotion had certainly changed the course of her life entirely, but on her own hard-won understanding that she had always been worth choosing, worth defending, and worth loving, long before anyone else had recognized it plainly enough to say so aloud. A letter arrived from Charlotte not long after, full of cheerful news that made Eleanor laugh aloud as she read it aboard the quiet parlor of their coastal house. Her cousin had, in the months following the wedding, formed an unexpected attachment to a modest but kind gentleman farmer who lived near the Whitmore estate, a man with none of the fortune or rank Lady Prudence had always insisted Charlotte deserved, but who made her laugh easily and treated her, in Charlotte's own words, as though her opinions actually mattered. Lady Prudence had objected at first, predictably, but Charlotte had held firm, and in time, even her mother had relented, worn down perhaps by watching Eleanor's own happiness prove every one of her old certainties wrong. "I find I no longer wish to marry for anything but genuine affection," Charlotte had written. "You taught me that, Eleanor, more than you know, simply by refusing to settle for less than what you truly wanted, even when it seemed the harder, more frightening choice." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and set it aside, smiling at the thought of her cousin, once a careless rival, now a true and valued friend, finding her own version of the happiness Eleanor had fought so hard to claim for herself. That evening, as she and Alexander sat together by the fire, she told him of Charlotte's news, and he listened with genuine warmth, remarking that it seemed the whole Whitmore household had been transformed by the events of the past year, in ways none of them could have predicted when a cruel remark at a country assembly first set everything in motion. "Perhaps," Alexander said, taking her hand in his as the fire crackled softly beside them, "your aunt did us an unintended kindness that night, however unkind her words were meant to be." Eleanor considered this for a moment, then smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the last light of evening faded beyond the windows. "Perhaps she did," she agreed, "though I think I shall let her believe, for the rest of her days, that she meant only cruelty by it. Some truths are kinder left unspoken, even when the outcome turns out well in the end." Alexander laughed softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, and the two of them sat together in comfortable silence, secure in a happiness built not on chance alone, but on courage, honesty, and the quiet, unshakable belief, hard-won through every hardship along the way, that Eleanor had always been worthy of exactly this. A year into her marriage, Eleanor stood in the entrance hall of Ashcombe House, staring at a letter that had just arrived from a solicitor in London, her hands trembling slightly as she read the contents for the second time. Alexander found her there minutes later, drawn by the unusual stillness in her posture, so different from her typical energy when moving through the busy household she now managed with quiet, practiced confidence. "What is it?" he asked, crossing the hall quickly to stand beside her. "It seems," Eleanor said slowly, still processing the words on the page, "that my grandmother, Margaret's mother, left behind a small property when she died some years ago, a cottage near the northern coast, along with a modest sum of money that has sat untouched in trust, waiting for any surviving descendant to claim it. The solicitor only recently traced the connection through the records your mother helped uncover last year." Alexander read the letter over her shoulder, his expression thoughtful. "It seems your family's history continues to reveal itself in unexpected ways," he said. Eleanor folded the letter carefully, a strange mixture of emotions settling over her, grief for a grandmother she had never known, gratitude for the unexpected inheritance, and a lingering wonder at how much of her own history had remained hidden for so long, waiting patiently to be discovered. "I should like to see it," she said finally. "The cottage. Would you come with me?" "Of course," Alexander said without hesitation. They traveled north together within the fortnight, leaving the demands of the estate in the capable hands of Alexander's steward for a brief holiday. Neither of them had anticipated taking so soon after the birth of their first child, a daughter named Grace, now nearly 6 months old, and already displaying, according to her doting father, the same quiet, steady determination that had first drawn him to her mother. The cottage, when they finally reached it after several days of travel, proved smaller and simpler than Eleanor had expected, a modest stone building overlooking a rugged stretch of coastline, clearly untouched for many years but sturdy despite its age. Inside, they found it mostly empty, though a few pieces of furniture remained, covered in dust sheets, along with a small collection of personal items left behind decades before, books, a worn writing desk, and, tucked into a drawer of that desk, a bundle of letters tied together with faded ribbon. Eleanor untied the ribbon carefully, her heart racing as she recognized the handwriting immediately, the same careful, elegant script from the portrait miniature she had found in her mother's jewelry box the year before. "They are from my grandmother," she said softly, scanning the first few lines. "Written to my mother, though it seems she never had the chance, or perhaps never found the courage, to send them." She read through the letters slowly over the following days, seated by the small window overlooking the sea while Alexander occupied himself with Grace nearby, watching his daughter's small fingers close around his own with the same fascinated tenderness he had shown since her birth. The letters revealed a woman who had never stopped loving the daughter she had been forced to give up, who had followed news of Margaret's life from a careful distance whenever it reached her, who had grieved, in private and unspoken sorrow, the family bond that scandal and fear had denied them both. "I wonder why she never sent them," Eleanor said one evening, setting the last letter aside with damp eyes. "Perhaps she feared rejection," Alexander suggested gently. "Or perhaps she simply could not find the words adequate to explain everything she had lost and gained in staying silent all those years." Eleanor thought of her own mother then, of the quiet sadness she had sometimes glimpsed beneath her gentle warmth, and wondered whether some part of her had always sensed the loss she carried, even without knowing its full shape. She found herself grateful, in a way she had not expected, for the chance to finally understand that sadness, to give it a name and a history, rather than carrying it forward as an unexplained shadow the way her mother had been forced to do. They stayed at the cottage for nearly 2 weeks, longer than either of them had originally planned, drawn by the quiet peace of the place and the slow, careful work of understanding everything it held. Eleanor decided, before they left, that she would not sell the property, despite Alexander's gentle suggestion that maintaining a second, distant house might prove impractical. Instead, she resolved to restore it slowly, over time, as a place their own children might visit someday, a physical connection to a history that had so nearly been lost entirely. "This belongs to Grace someday," she told Alexander, standing in the small garden behind the cottage as the sun set over the water. "And to any other children we might have. I want them to know where they came from, all of it, the difficult parts as well as the good, so that none of them ever grow up believing, as I once did, that their worth depends on what others choose to tell them about their own history." Alexander wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close as they watched the last light fade over the sea. "I think that is a fine inheritance to leave them," he said, "far more valuable than the cottage itself." They returned home eventually to the familiar demands of the Ashcombe estate, but Eleanor carried something new with her from that journey, a settled sense of completeness that had been missing even in the midst of her happiness over the preceding year. She had spent so long believing herself unworthy, so long enduring her aunt's cruelty without any understanding of the fuller, richer history that had shaped her family's circumstances, and finding that history at last, however painful parts of it proved to be, gave her a foundation she had never quite possessed before. Lady Prudence visited occasionally in the years that followed, her relationship with Eleanor never quite reaching the warmth Eleanor shared with Alexander's mother, but softened considerably from the sharp cruelty that had once defined every interaction between them. She doted, in her own reserved way, on Grace and the children who followed, and Eleanor found she could extend a measure of genuine, if cautious, forgiveness toward the aunt who had caused her so much pain, understanding now some of the fear and insecurity that had likely driven her aunt's harshest behavior over the years. Charlotte married her gentleman farmer the following spring, in a small, joyful ceremony that Eleanor attended with genuine happiness, watching her cousin exchange vows with a man who clearly adored her without reservation. The two women remained close for the rest of their lives, their early rivalry long forgotten, replaced by a friendship built on shared understanding and mutual respect. And Eleanor herself, in the years that followed, became known throughout the county not simply as the Duchess of Ashcombe, though she carried that title with quiet grace, but as a woman who used her position to help others in circumstances similar to those she had once faced herself. The trust she and Alexander established grew steadily, offering support and advocacy to young women without family or fortune to protect them, and Eleanor made a point of meeting many of them personally, sharing her own story when it might offer comfort or courage to someone facing similar cruelty and doubt. She never forgot the girl who had once stood frozen in a ballroom, certain that no gentleman would ever choose her, certain that her aunt's harsh words spoke some fundamental truth about her worth. But she carried that memory now not as a wound, but as a reminder of how far she had traveled since that night, and of how thoroughly wrong even the cruelest, most confident judgments could prove to be, when a person found, at last, the courage to believe in something better for themselves. On quiet evenings when the household had settled and the children were finally asleep, Eleanor would sometimes walk alone through the gardens of Ashcombe House, past the old oak tree where Alexander had once told her she had been taught wrong about her own worth, and allow herself simply to feel grateful for the courage that had carried her through her darkest moments, for the man who had ridden through the night to find her, and for the quiet, unshakable knowledge that she had built, at last, a life entirely her own, worthy in every sense that truly mattered. It was on one such evening, several years after their marriage, that Alexander found her there, watching the sunset paint the sky in the same warm golds and deep burgundies she had come to love from the coastal cottage. He settled beside her on the familiar stone bench, and for a while, neither of them spoke, content simply to share the quiet together. "Do you ever think of that night?" he asked eventually, "of the assembly, and everything your aunt said?" "I do," Eleanor admitted, "though it no longer holds the power over me it once did. I think of it now the way one thinks of weather long since past, a storm that felt unbearable at the time, but that cleared eventually into something far better than I could have imagined possible." Alexander took her hand, turning it gently in his own. "I am grateful for that storm. In a strange way," he said. "Without it, I might never have crossed that ballroom floor. I might never have known you at all." Eleanor smiled, leaning into him as the last light faded over the garden. "Then perhaps my aunt deserves a small measure of credit after all," she said, "though I maintain she shall never hear it from me directly." They sat together as darkness settled fully over the grounds, two people who had each, in their own way, learned to set aside the fears and expectations others had tried to impose upon them, choosing instead a life built on honesty, courage, and a love neither title nor scandal had ever managed to diminish. Grace grew alongside two younger brothers in the years that followed, each of them raised with the same quiet conviction Eleanor had fought so hard to claim for herself, that their worth was never a matter for others to determine, but something they carried within themselves from the very beginning, waiting only to be recognized and believed. Eleanor made certain they knew the full story of their family's history, the difficult parts as well as the joyful ones, believing firmly that understanding where one came from, in all its complicated truth, was itself a kind of inheritance far more valuable than any title or fortune could provide. And so the story that had begun with a cruel remark in a crowded ballroom found its quiet, lasting conclusion not in the grandeur of a wedding or the drama of a midnight ride, though both had mattered a great deal, but in the steady, ordinary happiness of a life built with care, honesty, and an unshakable belief in one's own worth. A belief that no aunt's cruelty, no scandal, and no old family secret had ever managed, in the end, to take away.